is something that you talk about a lot. But I'm absolutely with you there. The system itself is not sustainable. It just absolutely isn't, and something has to be done. And not just about nuclear power, but about the whole economic structure of the system and the power structure within it. Before everybody in the world, just doesn't survive. It's quite terrifying.
Well, I mean, here's an example. 30 years ago, and I've talked to top economists on this subject, the U.S. and British governments and others gave out pretty accurate economic numbers on unemployment, on inflation. Now they just put out completely fake numbers. They say unemployment's 8.9, it's really 22 plus. They say inflation's 3%, it's really 11 or more. And I mean, it's almost a insanity by the ruling class now, where their children are breathing this radiation. And I mean, in Chernobyl in '86, they made a real effort, as you know, to keep people from eating the food and drinking the milk for at least 6 months, to mitigate some of it. Now there's not even an attempt.
Yes, that's right. The Soviets, although everyone at the beginning of this Fukushima catastrophe were talking about how it wasn't anything like Chernobyl, actually the Soviet authorities evacuated people from Chernobyl very quickly, and they really did do their best. What we see here is an almost totally cynical and criminal set of policies which are sacrificing an enormous number of people to a kind of god of nuclear futures. And I'm not quite sure how it happens, because people ask me again and again, they say, how is it that these people don't recognize that they themselves and their children will suffer the consequences of these exposures? But it does seem as if they don't. It seems as if there's some kind of zombification or Sovietization of history in the West now, where the big newspapers, and I include the Guardian, where George Monbiot was writing his pieces, having been converted to nuclear, they seem to have become part of an appalling sort of cover-up system, rather like the worst days of Stalin. It's really hard to know where this is all going.
You've really put a good verbal description of it, of something that is indescribably insane. But breaking down the real history, which they now admit, for those that don't know, because it's been buried, what really happened if we go back to the tsunami, March 11th, almost 10 months ago, 2011, what really happened with those 6 reactors? Okay, well, as far as we can tell, what happened was this, that there was an enormously powerful earthquake, and that the earthquake caused damage to the reactors before the tsunami hit. And this damage to the reactors cut off the cooling supply to the reactors. And so, of course, they started to melt, they started to boil, and the water boiled away, and then the rods started to melt down. Now, the story is that, in fact, they went into cold shutdown automatically at the time of the earthquake. And then what happened was that the backup generators, the systems that were supposed to continue to provide cooling, were wiped out by the water from the tsunami. It actually really doesn't matter that much which of those is correct, because what then happened was that there were, in my opinion, nuclear explosions and hydrogen explosions, which effectively destroyed most of those reactors in the first week. And we can tell that from levels of radioactivity that were measured in various detectors quite far to the south of Tokyo. You can see the levels of radiation increasing and staying high in the week following, on the Monday following the tsunami. So we know even at that time that the reactors had melted down. But at that time, the International Atomic Energy Agency and TEPCO and the Japanese government were still telling people that there was no problem, that the reactor pressure vessels were intact and so forth. It was clear to me, looking at the video footage on YouTube, and in fact, isn't it interestingly depressing that we have to now get our accurate news from YouTube rather than from the newspapers? But looking at the video footage on YouTube, you could see that the force of the explosion, at least in reactor number 3, was so great that it couldn't possibly be a hydrogen explosion. And at that time, I was saying it was a nuclear explosion like the Chernobyl explosion. And by the way, I've had people on the show who aren't physicists, and they just say, oh, that's impossible. But I've talked to other physicists, and they say, no, that things can purify out into levels, and that you can get smaller explosions, and here you are, you're an acclaimed physicist. You're saying this can happen, but the media went along with it and said that can't happen.
No, I know they said it couldn't happen, but there was a very famous British physicist who talked about the famous explosion at Fukushima in Chelyabinsk in 1959, which was a similar explosion in a spent fuel pond. And he said that couldn't happen either, but it did happen. And I think the way in which it happens is that when these tell you what, stay there.
This is riveting. Stay there, Dr. Busby. We'll come back, talk more about Fukushima, what's currently happening there, and then we'll look at all these other disasters.
That's the sound of your door being...
All right, we've got our guest for this segment and part of the next that I'm getting into. The latest on Ron Paul, North Korea, the Iran situation, the economy. It is all coming up. And then we've got joining us, Lindsey Williams. And we'll take phone calls while he's on with us, by the way. Dr. Busby, you were getting into how nuclear explosions can take place. And, of course, after you first reported this, they did pick up the isotopes that they had to admit only happened during those type of explosions.
Yes, that's right. We still don't know exactly what the concentrations of the isotopes are that would enable us to tell the kind of explosion that occurred. But my point that I would make is this, is that actually you have, at least in the reactor where I think there was a nuclear explosion, you have plutonium and uranium mixed together. Now, if the temperature gets high enough, then what happens is that one of those will distill off at a different temperature and then concentrate at a cooler part of the reactor vessel or the tank that this is contained in. And, of course, it only needs to have a few kilograms of that to form a critical mass, and then you've got an atom bomb. So there's a mechanism that's quite easy to explain. It's exactly like distilling alcohol and water. You're distilling plutonium and uranium, but just at a much higher temperature. And so then when all the alcohol stroke plutonium comes together in one place, bang.
And you've also got explosions going on around it that could be the precursor explosion.
There's an awful lot that we don't know about what goes on in these sort of situations, and I think the fact is that the scientists don't either. And this brings me to a point that I would like to quickly make, which is this, that physicists deal with mathematics, and they reduce the whole world into very simplistic equations which they believe are capable of explaining the world, but actually very often they find that they aren't, because they haven't put something in the equation that they didn't think of.
Chaos theory.
Well, all sorts, absolutely, all sorts of stuff. I mean, just remember that physicists have lost 95% of the universe. They call it dark matter. They don't know what it is. So whether we should believe physicists or not when they talk to us about nuclear power stations and all their calculations is a very interesting question.
Well, they've proven from
what there is in the universe.
Sure, as you know, Doctor, there's now been Nobel Prizes handed out proving that when you have these black holes, you have these quasars, you have these exploding suns, that they're finding that the energy isn't there for that and that it is dark matter.
Exactly so, but dark matter is a bit like just invoking a demon, you know. You put together a whole load of equations and you say this will give us the answer, and you find it only gives you 5% of the answer. You say, well, the rest of it is a demon. Well, I know you call it dark matter, but it's not a lot different from Holy Mother Church at the time of Galileo, as far as I can see.
Yeah, man has got a lot of high-tech technologies, but doesn't even understand most of what's connected to it.
I think that's true. I think that the last century was the century of the physicists, and it's about time we moved away from that and realized that physics is a very powerful tool, but it's a very reductionist tool, and it's about time that people started to think for themselves and that they stopped believing in this sort of magical idea that the physicist knows what he's talking about, because generally speaking he doesn't. And in the case of radiation and health, which was my area, he certainly doesn't, because lots of people are going to die as a result of Fukushima, and at the moment they're saying nobody is.
Well, I've seen reports in Japan, though, that people are dying, but who worked there, but they're always saying something else did it.
Of course, that's what they will say. It's exactly what they said with Chernobyl. We've just had a book, incidentally, which I hope to plug. It's called Fukushima and Health, What to Expect. And it's based entirely upon the research that was done after Chernobyl. So we kind of know what's going to happen at Fukushima. And it's already happening. I get emails regularly telling me that people are just dropping dead. You know, school children are dropping dead. 1 minute they're there, and then their heart stops and they fall down dead. And this is exactly what we found in Chernobyl, because the cesium gets into the heart muscle and it destroys heart muscle. And when a certain amount of heart muscle is gone, the heart is no longer viable. And then you get a heart attack and die.
incredible. You know, I wanted to get you back on to give us the latest on Fukushima. I didn't even know you had a book out, but when we come back from break, please, I want people to get it and read it and pass it on to friends. So we'll definitely talk about the book when we come back. We're about to go to break, but what's the latest? Because they're claiming that they've stabilized Fukushima, but we've heard this quite a bit in the last 9 months.
Well, I think this is discourse manipulation. I mean, stabilized means that it's not any worse than it was when they stabilized it. But if by that they're somehow saying it's safe, they're wrong. I mean, we know that their xenon isotopes are coming out in the last month that show that very short half-life isotopes that show that it's continuing to fission. And I think it's pretty certain that the fuel is molten and it's gone through the reactor pressure vessel and it's in the ground. And Russia Today are telling me that the big cracks in the ground and steam is coming out and so on. So we're talking about a very serious situation which they're just trying to downplay because they want to limit the damage that it's going to cause to the development of nuclear power worldwide.
Well, all I know is they've got a history of covering this stuff up, and it's not safe.
Well, you're right there. You're right there. And it's continuing, that history.
Well, and I wouldn't all just blame it on physicists. I mean, obviously, you're a physicist, so you can talk about your own discipline. But look, 25 years ago, they said never use DU in war. It's deadly. It blows back. It's a soft kill weapon, a delayed kill. You can't use it. And in 91, they just said, we're going to use it. And now they just say it's good for the troops. We'll be right back. Okay, we're going to spend another 10 minutes or so with Dr. Busby. Then I'm getting into more of the world news. And then we're going to get our next guest on and open the phones up for Lindsey Williams. I promise to get him back to take your calls and recap what his big oil company exec source has been telling him that's turning out to be very, very accurate. Remember about a year and a half ago, he said they were going to destabilize the Middle East and launch a big war, but then next it would be China. First Iran, then China. We're going to get into all that coming up with Lindsey Williams, author Lindsey Williams. Going back to Dr. Christopher Busby, who's a chemical physicist and a leading expert on the effects of radiation on humans, studying Chernobyl and other events. He was the one that first said this is much bigger than Chernobyl, and now they admit it's many, many, many Chernobyls, but the response is different. But during the break, we were discussing why the ruling class is so insane, and then Dr. Busby, was getting into that he doesn't believe in aliens, but one would just say it's almost like aliens wanted to destroy the Earth or change the habitat, but then he expanded and said, but it's more of just an out-of-control system. And I said, yeah, like Richard Nixon talked about the fact that it was like a wild beast, a machine, an animal, the whole system. And the sum of our actions that we don't even see as bad adds to this giant machine. I mean, take GMO. Every major study, organ failure in the mice, the rats, infertility. But their science shows it does have this effect that bugs won't eat it. And so what if it does this? Because the mathematics say we've changed this trait. So what if it changes all these other traits? And as I said going to break, the craziness is intensifying, where I've had doctor, physicist, chemist in his own right, Dr. Doug Rockey on. And their manuals on DU they had in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And he wrote the manual on it in the early 90s. And he's on tomorrow, said, DU, you can't use it because it ignites in the barrel of the cannon or the gun, and you breathe it, and it will reduce your life massively. It will kill you. And we can't use it. Well, they had all this stuff stored, and they said in 1990, we're going to go ahead and use it. But then they still did some decontamination. Now they have them at shooting ranges for the military, proving grounds, bases everywhere.